Tonight, I am going to abstain from the temptation to talk about my beard. I found one or two, possibly more, silver strands in my beard. I have a very youthful spirit, and I believe that my youthful spirit, my pure eternus, the eternal child, animates me from within, keeps me youthful from without. In the spirit of silver hairs, I want to talk about death. I know. You don't want to hear about death. You don't want to talk about death. But I've got good news about death. Have you ever heard that before? I've got good news about death. Really good news. Breaking news about death. See, billions of human beings have engineered either very impersonal theological answers to the question of death, or quite intimate autobiographical answers to death that arise only within the peculiarity of their own lived experience. Perhaps these answers are so idiosyncratic that they have not been passed on in common lore, in what is now global literature. I don't want my wisdom to be obscured by time. I don't want my perspectives on death to die with me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about it. I hope you can stay with me. My reflections are occasioned by Terminator 2. I happen to catch the final scenes. Arnold Schwarzenegger is the T-800. He's going after another Terminator, which is a T-1000. And that T-1000 is more advanced than the T-800. The T-1000 is liquid metal. And the T-1000 is actually going after John Connor, which is the human being who's going to lead the resistance against the robots, otherwise known as Skynet, in the future. Arnold Schwarzenegger's T-800 Terminator is sent back to protect John Connor, whereas in the original Terminator, he was sent back to kill John Connor. So now this T-800 Arnold Schwarzenegger Terminator is going after the T-1000 liquid metal Terminator. Going after is a little bit of a semantic twist because it's a dance between going after the T-1000 and running away from the T-1000, because the T-1000 is more advanced than the T-800 by 200 points. Those 200 points consist of liquid metal. Arnold Schwarzenegger is bested by the T-1000 and is killed, but draws upon a reserve battery source, reanimates, and eventually destroys the T-1000. Arnold Schwarzenegger came back from the dead. He was dead, but then came back to life. Now, I would like to talk about us humans. We normally think of ourselves as afraid of death. Most of us, but not all of us. I had one friend who was absolutely terrified of death, and I offered to teach him how to surpass his fear of death, because I said to him that I don't fear death because of my meditation practice. But I've always wondered, am I full of shit? I'm thinking of Shunryu Suzuki, who wrote Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, and there was a biography of him called The Crooked Cucumber. And there's an episode in The Crooked Cucumber where he is drowning at the bottom of a creek, and he feels his fear of death at the bottom of the creek. And obviously he survives, but he reflects upon how in those final moments, or so he thought they were his final moments, he was terrified, and he realized he had not meditated deeply enough, and he had to hasten and strengthen his spiritual practice, which is Zazen, among other Zen practices, because he really understood in those final moments that he was in fact afraid of death. And he's like, well, if I'm a Zen master, although he probably didn't call himself a Zen master, I need to come face to face with death and surpass my fear of death, or at least not be so fucking terrified when I'm drowning at the bottom of a creek. There's another mystic named Ramana Maharshi, a Hindu sage of the Advaita Vedanta tradition in India, and he's got this extraordinary phrase that I love to sprinkle into conversations now and again, which is, whatever doesn't exist in deep sleep is not real. He also has another statement which says the body is a thought. Even more deeply, let's examine the perspective that says death is a thought. You can test this for yourself the next time you're on a plane and you're flying over the Atlantic Ocean and you feel turbulence, and the first thought that you have is of death, and you become horrified, terrified. But of course, if you see that, you can let go of that thought and be so profoundly present that the thought of death doesn't arise. Why? Because the thought of the body is not arising. Why? Because you're so intensely present. But what is intense presence in that context of a jet experiencing terrible turbulence over the Atlantic? See, there is a dimension of awareness right now where there is no thought of the body. There is no thought of death. That dimension is very, very present. Another way of discussing that dimension of consciousness is to use the word Sat Chit Ananda. Sat Chit Ananda, which is being consciousness bliss. Right now you can rest and abide as being consciousness bliss. It's your natural state of awareness. There is no thought of the body, and there is no thought of death. For fun, you can experiment in this state of consciousness. You can think of death. You can let it trickle up like a groundswell, a little stream of water into consciousness, the thought of death. And you will see that it has no purchase. Why? Because there's no thought of the body. The thought of death, it means the termination of the thought of the body. But when you abide as being consciousness bliss, the thought of the body doesn't arise. Ergo, the thought of death doesn't terrorize the thought of the body. So let's probe further. Deepen the inquiry. What is life without the thought of death? Let's say that you lived in such a way that the thought of death never occurred to you. What would life be? I'm not saying that there is no death. I'm just saying that there's no thought of death. There's no fear of death. There's no identification with the thought of the body. Now you can tell when you've slipped out of that consciousness because there's a contraction in the heart. That's where you'll learn immediately that you're succumbing to the fear of death. The heart is where you realize you've succumbed to the thought of the body. Otherwise, there's limitless radiance, unperturbed and uncircumscribed radiance. It is none other than the suchness of consciousness itself, being, consciousness, bliss. So ask yourself, if you were able to abide as being, consciousness, bliss, if that were your natural state of being, what is the thought of death? What is the body? Now in that state of being, consciousness, bliss, where radiance is uncircumscribed and limitless, the body is everything. The body is everywhere. There's only body-mind everywhere. And you'll find that the thought of death, the thought of the physical body, this skin bag, is what reins it all in. There's a tight encasement known as the egoic identity. That's what's going to die, because that is the thought of death. The thought of the body is the thought of death. And I mean that in a very deep kind of existential sense. Not in the sense of, oh, I scratched myself on the hand and it's bleeding, that's the thought of the body, I'll get a band-aid. I mean, ultimately that's totally connected to the larger frame that I'm discussing. So much of the nonsense in this world ultimately derives from our fear of death and is ultimately rooted in our thought of the body. Again, in this larger context, the thought of the body is the thought of death. If you do not have the thought of death, and the thought of this body as a limited, circumscribed, contained skin bag vanishes. And the body is all. Which is why you can feel so profoundly. Why your sensitivity is capital S sensitivity and extends omnidirectionally and feels everything. Which is why we also can capitalize intimacy, capital I, intimacy. Because without the thought of the body, which is the thought of death, intimacy is unlimited. You can feel the wings of a butterfly flapping inside you, even when it's 10 feet away. Now, in that context, imagine a grizzly bear is running at you and is going to devour you. You have the thought of the body. You have the thought of death. You're drowning at the bottom of a creek. And you're no longer the Zen master you thought you were. What then? Really? Do you run? Do you let the grizzly bear devour you? Of course, that's a little bit absurd, isn't it? Have we run into an impasse? No pun intended. You're gonna run. The amygdala, right there in your reptilian brain, the fight or flight is gonna get triggered and you're gonna flee. You're not gonna fight the grizzly. So when you're feeling that fear of the death of the body, because you've had the thought of death and the thought of the body, because the grizzly is attacking you, is everything I just said bullshit? Could be. Right? Could be. Could be that these wonderfully metaphysical, esoteric, hyper-spiritual perspectives only work in the ashram or the monastery or the meditation center. That when we're out there in the woods taking a shit with the bear, then all bets are off. But think about that closely. Because we can also plug these perspectives into another context where we think about the insanity of the world, the global psychosis. Can we maintain our spiritual perspectives there? What difference does it make? If I'm surrounded and oppressed and suffocated by global psychosis, what does it mean to not have the thought of death and not have the thought of body? So we've got the grizzly bear in the woods or the global psychosis in the office. And then we have no thought of the body, no thought of death. But frankly, it sounds absolutely impossible. I understand that. You also have to imagine what happens when you do concede to the thought of the body and the thought of the death inside the global office building of psychosis, or the bear shitting in the woods and then coming for your throat. You're going to be fucking terrified. You're going to be horrified because of whether it's your corporate CEO walking towards your cubicle or the grizzly pawing your face in half. You still have a choice. Will you feel the terror of the thought of the body? Will you feel the terror of the thought of death? Or will you feel more deeply what you more deeply are, which is being, consciousness, bliss? What is life? What is life? If there's no thought of the body and there's no thought of death, what is life? What is life? Without the thought